Hello friends, I am Professor Nisar Ahmed Khan from Department of Economics, Aligarh Muslim University. Today I'll talk about financial instruments, and if time permits, we'll also talk about financial intermediaries. So financial instruments are very important instrument in the financial system because it facilitates the transfer of funds from surplus budget units to the deficit budget units, that is from ultimate lender to the ultimate borrower. These financial instruments are basically means of payment. Now, in the case of financial instruments, usually for the issuer, these financial instruments are liabilities, and for the holder, these are assets. So many people say that financial instruments are nothing but financial assets. But then there are certain financial assets, financial instruments which we cannot call as financial assets. And what are these? For example, in the case of financial assets, there is one issuer and there is another holder. But there are certain financial instruments where the financial instruments are neither issued by the one party nor by the other party. It is being issued by a third party. I'd like to explain it with the help of an example. Suppose there is a buyer of goods, and there is a seller. So the seller wants to sell some goods and the buyer wants to buy the goods. Now there is a third party. And that third party gives a guarantee to the sellers that you sell the goods and don't bother about the payment will be made. So if this guarantee is given to the seller, then seller will immediately ship the goods to the buyer without any hesitation, because the seller knows that there is a third party which has given the guarantee to make the payment. So here the instrument issued by the third party neither belong to the seller nor it belong to the buyer. It is issued by the third party. So these type of financial instruments, we call them as contingent asset. Contingent asset. So if you also include the contingent assets, then financial instruments are nothing but simply financial assets. So let's have a formal definition of financial instruments. We can define financial instruments, rather we can give a very broad definition of financial instrument. So all type of financial instruments are covered. So financial instrument is a written legal obligation of one party, legal obligation by one party to transfer something of value to other party at a given date under stated conditions. So, it is nothing but simply a legal document. It is simply a legal paper, and it is an obligation by one party to transfer. It is an obligation by one party to transfer something of value to other party at a given date under stated conditions. Now, one party may be an individual, or the party may be a company, or the party may be the government. Similarly, the other party may be an individual, or a company, or government. So, this is a very broad definition, meaning thereby simply it is a legal obligation on the part of one party to transfer something of value to other party at a given date and under stated condition. Now, this is a very broad definition of financial instrument. As I told you earlier that financial instruments are nothing but simply financial assets. So, the question is, what are these financial assets and what are different types of financial assets? So, these financial assets can be classified into a number of groups. We can have, broadly speaking, two groups. One is that we will use the criteria those financial instruments which can be termed as an instrument to store value, and those financial instruments which transfer which serve as an instrument to transfer risk from one party to another party. So, in this way, we can divide the financial instruments into two groups. The financial instruments which serve as an instrument to store value, and the financial instruments which serve as an instrument to transfer risk from one party to another party. In the case of store of value, we have a number of financial assets which serve as a store of value. These are deposits. One can easily store his wealth in the form of a deposit. Similarly, we have loans. There is one party which may decide to store value in long-term loans given to another party. Then we have bonds, equity, insurance scheme, mutual funds, derivatives, etc. These are the financial instruments which help us to store value. Then there are other financial instruments. Sorry, we have written insurance schemes. Insurance schemes are not covered here. Okay. So, there are some other financial instruments which help in the transfer of risk from one party to another party. That these instruments transfer risk from one party to another party. These instruments can be written as insurance scheme, insurance schemes. These are forward contracts, futures contract and swaps. If this is so, then we have to remove the derivatives also from here, because derivatives also help in transferring the risk from one party to another party, and that's why the derivatives cannot be grouped as an instrument to store value. It will fall in the second group, that is, it helps in the transfer of risk from one party to another party. Though all these instruments which help in transfer of risk from one party to another party can also be used as a store of value. But then we have given a broad classification, and we have here only those instruments which serve as a store of value can be used. These instruments can be used for storing value. Other instruments which help in transfer of risk. Now let us have a list of the financial instruments or financial assets, and that will help us in knowing what are these financial assets, because this is the classification where we have used a broad criteria to classify the financial instruments into two groups. Now I'll provide a list of the financial instruments. This list of the financial instruments is the financial instruments are from the money market as well as capital market, because these financial instruments belong to the financial system and they are found in both the markets, money market as well as capital market, because in both the markets the funds are transferred from the surplus budget unit to the deficit budget units, and these financial instruments help in that process. So one is deposit, another is loans, and then we have certificates of deposit which we call as CDs. We have told you about the CDs in case of money market. We have also CPs, commercial papers. Commercial papers are also found in money market, and we have repos and call money. Then we have bonds, we have bills of exchange, both the treasury bill as well as commercial bills. Then we have equities, and we have derivatives, and here we have insurance scheme, insurance schemes, as well as we have a small saving scheme. Here in India, these schemes are mostly run through the post offices, and there are various types of certificates which are issued and purchased by the investor with a view to earn attractive rate of interest. So these are the some financial instruments. We have provided a list of the financial instruments, and these instruments primarily they transfer the funds from surplus budget unit to the deficit budget units in the financial system. They belong to both. Some of these belong to money market, some of these belong to capital market, and some of these are found in both the markets like loans and deposits. Now, as far as deposits, loan, CDs and CPs, repos, call money, we have already told about all these. We will talk in detail about the bonds because as far as bills of exchange is concerned, we have explained the bills of exchange in case of money market. Equities, we will also talk about equities now, and derivatives will not talk now because there is a full-fledged lecture on derivatives and we will talk about derivative there. Insurance schemes, we know about these schemes that help in that provide protection to the person who has purchased this insurance scheme, and in the event of happening a misfortune, he is compensated and the money is being paid from the pool of funds from the pool of funds by the people participating in the schemes. Then there are a number of small saving schemes, and these small saving schemes also help in transferring the funds from the surplus budget unit to the deficit budget units. So we'll basically talk now about bonds and equities. So first we'll talk about the equities. What are different types of equities? We have told you about the equity because equity is simply when the owner of a firm or a company decides to sell a portion of his ownership to the general public or to any other person. That is, he is going to sell a portion of the ownership and the purchaser will become owner, and his ownership will be limited to his contribution and the number of shares, the value of shares that and number of shares that he has purchased. That is, he will become entitled to get dividend, that is a share in the profit as per his ownership, in proportion of his ownership. So, we'll first talk about the equity. Bonds we'll talk about later on. Equity, of several types. The two important types are ordinary shares and another is right issue or right shares or right issues. Ordinary share is the ordinary equity, but there is another share which also comes in the category of equity, but it is a hybrid instrument known as preference shares. Ordinary shares are the same thing that we just defined. The right shares are simply the shares issued to those who are already holding the shares of the company. These shares we call as right shares. Preference shares is a hybrid share. It has the features of both bond as well as equity. The holder of the preference share will get a fixed dividend, and the holder of the preference shares usually does not have voting rights. But the holder of the preference share will get preference in payment of dividend over the holder of ordinary shares. That is, when the dividend or the profit will be distributed, first of all, it will be given to the holder of preference shares, and then the remaining amount would be distributed among the holders of ordinary shares. In the event of bankruptcy also, that is, if the company is going to be bankrupt, then the holder of preference share will get preference in the matter of payment over the holder of ordinary share. So preference shares holder get fixed dividend, and these preference shares can be of several types. Some of these types are: the preference share may be convertible or non-convertible. Convertible preference shares are those preference shares which are converted into ordinary share after a specified period of time. These convertible preference shares may be fully convertible preference shares or partially convertible preference shares. Fully convertible preference shares, where all the preference shares will be converted into ordinary shares after a given period of time, and partial preference shares, convertible preference shares, are those preference shares which will be where a part of the preference share that a person or a company is holding will be converted into ordinary shares. So then we have redeemable preference shares. Redeemable preference shares are those preference shares where the issuer can buy back these shares or purchase these shares after a specified period of time at a specified price. So these are called as redeemable preference shares. Against that, we have non-redeemable preference shares which cannot be purchased or cannot be bought back by the issuer. Then we have cumulative preference shares or non-cumulative preference shares. Cumulative preference shares are those preference shares in which if the dividend in certain year is not paid, then it is added in the dividend of the next year. And if the next year is again not paid, then it will be again added in the next year. That is, if the dividend is not paid in the certain years, then it will be added in the next year. And whenever the company has sufficient income and profit, the company will make the payment of dividend to the holder of preference shares. So these are cumulative. Against that, we have non-cumulative preference shares in which if the dividend in certain year or in a particular year is not paid, then it is lost. You will not get it. The holder will not get it. And the dividend he will get in the next year, and that will be the dividend for the next year. And the year in which dividend is not paid, that is lost. He will not be paid. So that is known as non-cumulative shares, preference shares. Then we have participatory preference shares and non-participatory preference shares. In the case of participatory preference shares, if the holder of the preference share no doubt will get the fixed dividend, but holder may get more than the fixed dividend if company performs well and earns more profit. That is, if company earns more profit and performs well, then holder of the participatory preference share may get more than the fixed dividend. If the preference shares are non-participatory, then the holder of the non-participatory preference shares will get only the fixed dividend, irrespective of the profit earned by the firm. Now we come to the bonds. These are the different types of equities and preference shares, ordinary shares and rights issue. We have told you about that. Now we come to the bonds. The other important financial instruments, bond. Remaining instruments we have told you about during our course of our lecture, so I will not repeat that.